The fluorescent lights of the Popeyes near Interstate 95 flickered at 2:47 a.m., casting intermittent shadows across the empty parking lot where a massive Kenworth T680 had just pulled in. The air brakes hissed like a warning as Marlo Pike stepped down from the cab, her boots hitting the cracked asphalt with a deliberate thud that echoed in the pre-dawn silence. She'd been driving for 14 straight hours, hauling 40,000 pounds of electronics from Seattle to Miami, and the weight of exhaustion should have been visible in every movement. Should have been. Inside the restaurant, 4 men occupied the corner booth furthest from the entrance, their positioning too strategic to be coincidence. The one facing the door, Garrison Steele, watched Marlo approach through the glass with the kind of smile that belonged more in a boardroom than a fast food restaurant at this ungodly hour. His 3 companions arranged themselves with practiced casualness that screamed tactical formation to anyone who knew what to look for. But then again, Garrison was counting on the fact that a tired female trucker wouldn't know what to look for. Marlo pushed through the door, and the bell's chime seemed to trigger something in Garrison's expression. A micro-adjustment of his features that transformed him from predator to philanthropist in the span of a heartbeat. He stood up, all 6 feet 2 inches of calculated charm, and moved toward the counter with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either dance training or something far more dangerous. "Excuse me, miss." Garrison's voice carried just the right amount of concern mixed with Midwestern friendliness. "I believe you dropped this in the parking lot." He held out a set of keys that definitely weren't Marlo's, his hand positioned so she'd have to reach across her body to take them, exposing her defensive vulnerabilities. It was textbook approach methodology, page straight out of the behavioral analysis playbook. Marlo's eyes flicked to the keys, then to Garrison's face, noting the expensive dental work behind his smile and the way his suit jacket, who wore a suit jacket at a Popeyes at 2:47 a.m., hung just loose enough to conceal a shoulder holster. "Those aren't mine," she said, her voice carrying the perfect note of tired confusion. "But thanks for checking." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. And then Garrison laughed. A sound so genuine, it would have fooled anyone who hadn't spent 12 years in Delta Force learning to distinguish real emotion from manufactured responses. "My mistake. These late-night hours, they play tricks on the mind." His hand moved in what appeared to be a casual gesture of putting the keys in his pocket. But his fingers brushed through Marlo's hair, so brief, so seemingly accidental, that even the security cameras would have missed the calculated nature of the touch. Now, if you think Garrison is just another creep harassing a woman at a truck stop, you're about to discover why this story will have you questioning every interaction you've ever had with a stranger. The layers we're about to peel back will change everything you thought you knew about predator and prey. If psychological thrillers that mess with your mind are your thing, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where nothing is what it seems. And hey, if you want to support the channel in bringing you these mind-bending narratives, the thanks button is always appreciated. Consider it your contribution to keeping the truth seekers in business. Behind the counter, Bethany Wade, 29, brunette ponytail, community college sweatshirt, watched the interaction with what appeared to be the bored disinterest of a minimum wage worker counting down to the end of her shift. Her fingers absently tapped on the register in what looked like nervous energy, but was actually a complex pattern that anyone monitoring the restaurant's internal network would recognize as data packet transmission. She'd been Garrison's eyes and ears in this location for 3 months, playing the role of struggling student so perfectly that even her supposed co-workers had contributed to a collection for her textbooks last month. "Can I help you?" Bethany asked Marlo, her voice pitched with just the right amount of exhausted customer service enthusiasm. "Large coffee, black, and a spicy chicken sandwich. Marlowe replied, pulling out a wallet that had seen better days. The leather was worn at the edges, held together with duct tape. Details that Garrison was cataloging from his peripheral vision as he returned to his booth, where Brixton Vance was pretending to be passed out drunk. Coulter Rush was scrolling through a phone with a cracked screen, and Damon Flint sat in absolute stillness that only someone trained in surveillance would recognize as hypervigilance disguised as stupor. "That'll be 847, Bethany said, and the specific amount wasn't random. It was a code that meant subject acquired, proceeding to phase 2. She watched Marlowe count out exact change, noting the slight tremor in her hands that could have been exhaustion or could have been the carefully controlled adrenaline response of someone maintaining deep cover. As Marlowe waited for her order, Garrison rose again, this time approaching with a $100 bill in his hand. "Please, let me cover that," he said, his voice dripping with apologetic sincerity. "I feel terrible about the confusion with the keys. You're clearly working hard, driving these late hours. It's the least I can do." The psychological play was elegant in its simplicity. Establish trust through generosity. Create a debt of gratitude that would make the target more susceptible to future manipulation. Marlowe's response would tell Garrison everything he needed to know about her psychological profile. Would she accept out of exhaustion? Refuse out of pride? Negotiate out of suspicion? She did none of those things. Instead, she smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "That's very kind, but my company has strict policies about accepting gifts. Liability issues, you understand." Garrison's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle redistribution of weight that suggested recalculation. "Of course, corporate America and its endless rules, right?" He returned the bill to his wallet with a gesture that allowed Marlowe to glimpse the interior. Multiple credit cards, all with different names, and what looked suspiciously like a federal badge that disappeared too quickly to identify. That's when Brixton woke up with a start, knocking over a cup of coffee that hadn't been there moments before. The liquid splashed across the floor, creating a hazard between Marlowe and the exit. Sorry," he slurred, his performance Oscar-worthy as he stumbled to his feet, forcing Marlowe to step backward toward the corner where the security cameras had a convenient blind spot. "No harm done," Bethany chirped, already coming around the counter with a mop that had been positioned just a little too conveniently. "Happens all the time on the late shift." She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd choreographed this exact scenario, herding Marlowe toward the bathroom alcove without seeming to do so. Coulter chose that moment to stand up, revealing himself to be taller than his slouched sitting position had suggested. "Brixton, you idiot," he said with the perfect mixture of fond exasperation and genuine annoyance. "This is why Claire left you." The mention of a personal detail, fabricated but psychologically resonant, was designed to make the scene feel more authentic, more random, less like the carefully orchestrated trap it actually was. Marlowe's hand moved to her pocket, a gesture that looked like she was checking her phone, but actually activated a recording device that would capture everything in high-definition audio for the next hour. Her fingers found the familiar shape of the transponder she'd been carrying for the past 7 months, ever since Task Force Omega had first identified Garrison Steele as the head of the Chameleon Circuit, a network that specialized in identifying, stalking, and extracting information from former military personnel using advanced psychological warfare techniques. "Bathrooms down that hall," Bethany offered helpfully, pointing toward the alcove. "Might want to wait there while I clean this up. These boys get a little rowdy when they've had too much to drink." She shot Garrison a look that seemed reproachful, but actually confirmed that the sonic interference equipment in the bathroom was operational, capable of blocking any communication devices while simultaneously recording every word spoken within its range. Marlowe nodded her thanks and walked toward the bathroom with the measured stride of someone trying to avoid confrontation. Behind her, she could hear Garrison's voice, pitched to Carrie. "Coulter, why don't you help the lady with her order while Bethany cleans up your friend's mess?" It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy. Separate the target from potential witnesses. Create multiple points of psychological pressure. Coulter moved to intercept Marlowe before she reached the bathroom, his body language shifting from drunk friend to something altogether more professional. "I'm really sorry about my associates," he said, and the word choice was deliberate. Not friends, but associates. A subtle reminder that this was business, not personal. "Let me make it up to you. I'm actually a lawyer, well, was a lawyer before I made some questionable choices." The confession was designed to create false intimacy, to make Marlowe feel like she was getting genuine vulnerability, when in fact every word was scripted. Marlowe stopped, turned slightly, enough to keep both Coulter and the booth in her peripheral vision. "No need for apologies. I've seen worse at truck stops from here to Seattle." The mention of Seattle wasn't random. It was a test to see if they'd react to knowing her route, if they'd already been tracking her longer than this encounter suggested. Garrison's eyes flickered, just for a microsecond, but it was enough. They knew about Seattle. They knew about the cargo. They probably knew about the task force, which meant this wasn't a random hunting expedition. This was targeted. This was personal. The bathroom door opened, and another woman emerged. Someone who hadn't been in the restaurant when Marlowe arrived. She was mid-40s, professional attire that had seen better days, and she moved with the kind of exhausted determination that suggested she'd been driving as long as Marlowe had. Except her shoes were wrong. Too new, too clean for someone who'd supposedly been on the road. "Oh, thank God, another woman," the stranger said, her relief seemingly genuine. "These places creep me out at night. Safety in numbers, right?" She extended her hand. "I'm Patricia. Patricia Vance." The last name wasn't a coincidence. This was Brixton's sister, another layer of the elaborate psychological operation. Create a false sense of female solidarity. Establish trust through shared vulnerability. Marlowe shook her hand, noting the lack of calluses that would have come from actual driving, the manicure that was maybe 2 days old. "Marlowe," she replied, using her real name because, at this point, maintaining her cover meant playing the role of someone who didn't realize she needed a cover. Here's where things get really interesting. Every person in this Popeyes right now is playing at least 3 different roles, and some of them don't even know what game they're really part of. Drop a comment below. Who do you think is the most dangerous person in this room? Is it Garrison with his psychological expertise, or is there someone else pulling strings we haven't seen yet? Patricia's expression shifted to concern. "You're that trucker who's been asking questions about missing veterans, aren't you? I heard about you at the Flying J outside Richmond." The information was specific enough to be credible, vague enough to prompt Marlowe to fill in the details herself. A classic interrogation technique disguised as casual conversation. Marlowe's pause was perfectly calibrated. Long enough to suggest surprise, short enough to avoid suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just haul freight." "Of course," Patricia said quickly, but her eyes had already catalogued Marlowe's reaction, measuring pupil dilation, respiratory changes, micro-expressions that revealed more than words ever could. "My mistake. It's just, there have been stories, you know, women veterans going missing along this corridor. 3 in the last 6 months." The number was accurate. The FBI had kept it out of the media, which meant Patricia, or whoever she really was, had access to federal databases. Marlowe felt the familiar tingle of danger that had kept her alive through 37 operations in Afghanistan, the same instinct that had made her Delta Force's most successful operator before she'd officially ceased to exist in any military record. Bethany appeared around the corner, mop in hand, but no bucket, a detail that would have been suspicious if Marlowe had actually been the exhausted trucker she was pretending to be. "Coffee's ready," she announced cheerfully, "and I threw in an apple pie on the house. You look like you could use the sugar boost." The apple pie was Phase 3. Garrison's team had done their research. They knew Marlowe's mother had made apple pies, that it was a psychological trigger tied to childhood memories of safety and comfort. The fact that they knew this meant they'd accessed her sealed juvenile records, the ones that were supposed to have been destroyed when she joined Delta Force. Marlowe accepted the bag with appropriate gratitude, allowing her shoulders to relax slightly as if the gesture had actually touched her. Inside, she was calculating escape routes, weapon availability, and the likelihood that backup was actually coming. The transponder in her pocket should have triggered a response by now, unless— "Your phone's been buzzing," Garrison observed from his booth, having positioned himself to see the slight illumination through her pocket fabric. "Dispatcher probably wondering where you are. These companies track everything nowadays, don't they? Every stop, every minute, every deviation from the route." The words were laden with subtext. He was telling her he knew she was being tracked, that he wasn't concerned about it, that whatever backup she thought she had wasn't coming. The psychological impact was immediate: isolation, doubt, the creeping realization that maybe she'd walked into something bigger than even Task Force Omega had anticipated. Damon finally moved, the first significant motion he'd made since Marlowe had entered. He stood up slowly, all house, 250 pounds of him unfolding with a grace that belonged in a ballet studio, not on someone his size. He didn't speak. Garrison's files said he never did, not since an IED in Fallujah had supposedly damaged his vocal cords. But Marlowe had read the real medical reports. His silence was psychological, not physical. He could speak. He chose not to. And that choice said more about his role in this operation than any words could have. "We should probably get going," Coulter said to his companions, but his tone suggested the opposite. "Long drive ahead." He pulled out his phone, a different one than before, and made a show of checking the time. 3:07. That's what, 20 minutes since you walked in? The specific mention of time was a pressure tactic, making Marlowe aware that every second was being counted, measured, analyzed. Marlowe took a sip of her coffee, using the motion to scan the restaurant again. The exits were still blocked. Brixton by the main door, Damon near the emergency exit, Patricia standing just close enough to the bathroom to prevent retreat. Garrison remained at his booth, the spider at the center of the web, watching everything with those eyes that had probably diagnosed 100 psychological profiles before breakfast. "You know what's funny?" Garrison said suddenly, his voice carrying across the restaurant with practiced projection. "I used to know someone who looked just like you. Same build, same way of carrying herself. She was in my psychology doctoral program at Johns Hopkins. Brilliant woman. Terrible at poker because she had this tell. She'd touch her throat whenever she was bluffing." Marlowe's hand was halfway to her throat before she caught herself, turned the motion into adjusting her collar instead. But Garrison had seen it, had triggered the response deliberately to establish psychological dominance. He was telling her he could read her, control her reactions, that she was already playing his game whether she knew it or not. "Small world," Marlowe replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge. "Though I've never been to Baltimore, never been east of the Mississippi until I started trucking." "Really?" Bethany interjected with false surprise. "But your accent, there's definitely some East Coast in there. Maybe Mid-Atlantic? I studied linguistics before switching to business." Another lie wrapped in truth. She had studied linguistics, but not at any college. Her training had come from the NSA before Garrison had recruited her with promises of more interesting applications for her skills. The net was tightening, each person adding layers of psychological pressure, probing for weakness, watching for the crack that would reveal Marlowe's true nature. But what they didn't know, what even Task Force Omega didn't know, was that Marlowe hadn't been randomly selected for this operation. She'd volunteered, had specifically requested it, because Garrison Steele had destroyed someone she loved. 3 years ago, her sister Grace Lynn had been a Navy intelligence officer stationed in Norfolk when she'd encountered Garrison at what she thought was a veterans support group. Within 6 months, he'd systematically destroyed her career, her relationships, and ultimately her will to live. The suicide note had mentioned a man who could become anyone, who could make you question your own reality until madness seemed like the only escape. The game these predators are playing is about to take a turn they never saw coming. Every move they've planned, every psychological trap they've set, someone else has been planning countermoves for much longer than they realize. The next few minutes are going to completely flip everything your goo-poo think you know about who's hunting whom. Marlowe had spent 2 years after Grace Lynn's death studying everything about Garrison Steele, his methods, his associates, his patterns. She'd learned that he recruited broken people and broke them further, turning them into weapons against their own kind. Bethany had been a whistleblower who'd lost everything when her reports were buried. Brixton had been discharged from the Marines for a crime he didn't commit. Coulter had been disbarred for refusing to prosecute an innocent man. Even Damon had a story, a decorated veteran whose entire unit had been killed by friendly fire that was covered up, leaving him as the only survivor with no one to believe his account. Garrison found these people at their lowest, offered them purpose, belonging, revenge against a system that had failed them. He turned their trauma into loyalty, their pain into power. The Chameleon Circuit wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a cult built on shared suffering and the promise that they could make others suffer the same way they had. "Your sandwich is getting cold," Patricia observed, her concern touching but calculated. "You should eat. Long drive ahead, right?" The sandwich. Marlowe had almost forgotten about it in the psychological chess match. She unwrapped it slowly, took a bite that she didn't taste, chewed mechanically while her mind raced through possibilities. The food could be drugged, but that would be too crude for Garrison's style. He preferred psychological victory over chemical submission. "You know what I love about places like this?" Garrison said, rising from his booth with casual grace. "They're liminal spaces, thresholds between here and there, between who we were and who we're becoming. 3 a.m. at a truck stop, Popeyes. You could be anyone, couldn't you? The uniform, the truck, the tired eyes. They're just costumes we wear." He was moving closer now, each step calculated for maximum psychological impact. Not threatening, not explicitly, but carrying the weight of inevitability. Marlowe held her ground, continued eating her sandwich as if his approach meant nothing, but her muscles were coiled, ready. "Take you, for instance," Garrison continued, now close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't belong in this setting. "Female trucker, working the long hauls alone. That takes courage, or desperation, or maybe you're running from something. The wedding ring tan line on your finger suggests recent divorce. The way you favor your left shoulder says old injury, probably military given your age and posture. The hypervigilance, despite apparent exhaustion. That's PTSD, isn't it? Afghanistan? Iraq?" Each observation was a scalpel cut, precise and revealing. He was showing her how much he could deduce, how vulnerable she was to his analysis. But he was also fishing, waiting for her to correct him, to provide information in the guise of denial. "You're very observant for a drunk businessman," Marlowe said, her tone neutral. "Must be useful in whatever it is you actually do." Garrison laughed, and this time it was genuine. The laugh of someone who'd just discovered the game might actually be interesting. "What I do? I help people find themselves, strip away all the lies we tell ourselves, all the masks we wear, until only truth remains." Sounds like therapy. Therapy assumes the patient wants to be helped. What I do is more archaeological. I excavate the truth, whether it wants to be found or not. Behind him, Brixton had moved closer to the door, while Damon had shifted to cover the emergency exit more completely. They were preparing for something, though whether it was to prevent Marlowe from leaving or someone else from entering remained unclear. Bethany's phone buzzed. A real notification this time, not performance. Her expression shifted minutely as she read whatever message had arrived. "Garrison," she said, and the use of his real name instead of whatever cover identity they'd been maintaining meant something significant had changed. He turned to her, eyebrow raised in silent question. "Weather's coming in," she said, and those 3 words carried weight that had nothing to do with meteorology. Fast, maybe 10 minutes out. Weather meant law enforcement in their coded language. 10 minutes meant they had that long before whatever response Marlowe's transponder had triggered arrived. But Garrison didn't look concerned. If anything, he seemed pleased. "Then we should probably conclude our business," he said, turning back to Marlowe with a smile that belonged on a shark. "You see, Ms. Pike, yes, I know your name. We've been having this conversation for much longer than you realize. Every stop you've made, every question you've asked about missing veterans, every breadcrumb you've followed that led you here tonight, we've been watching, guiding, orchestrating. The revelation should have been shocking, but Marlowe had suspected as much. The chameleon circuit didn't just hunt. They cultivated their prey, groomed them for maximum psychological impact when the trap finally closed. "The 3 missing women," Marlowe said, deciding to drop part of her own mask. "Where are they?" "Missing?" Garrison's confusion seemed genuine. "Oh, you mean Rebecca, Catherine, and Joanna. They're not missing. They're transformed. They work for me now, helping other lost souls find their way. Would you like to meet them?" The offer was poison wrapped in honey. If the women were alive but turned, it meant Garrison's psychological manipulation was even more effective than the FBI had suspected. It also meant that Marlowe's sister might not have been his first suicide, just the first one who'd chosen death over conversion. Patricia had moved closer during the exchange, close enough that Marlowe could see the small tattoo on her wrist, a chameleon that seemed to shift colors as her arm moved. They all had them, she realized, checking each person in turn. Different locations, different sizes, but the same symbol of their allegiance to Garrison's twisted philosophy. "I should go," Marlowe said, standing slowly, making sure to telegraph her movements to avoid triggering a physical response. "Long drive ahead." "You're not going anywhere," Garrison said softly, and the pretense finally dropped completely. "You came here hunting monsters, Marlowe Pike, former Delta Force, current Task Force Omega operative. But you forgot the first rule of hunting. Make sure you're not walking into a trap." The lights in the Popeyes flickered, not randomly this time, but in a pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Someone was signaling, but who? And to whom? That's when Marlowe smiled, and for the first time since she'd walked in, it was completely genuine. "You're right about one thing, Garrison. This is a trap. But you're wrong about who it's for." The SOS pattern in the lights wasn't random, it was Sterling Pike's signature, and Garrison's face went through 3 distinct emotional transitions as he processed what that meant. First confusion, then recognition, finally something that might have been fear if sociopaths were capable of such pure emotions. Sterling Pike, Garrison said slowly, tasting the name like poison. The FBI's golden boy. The one who got away from me in Denver. His eyes snapped to Marlowe's face, seeing the family resemblance for the first time. Your siblings. This isn't about the missing veterans at all. It's always been about Gracelyn, Marlowe confirmed, her entire posture shifting from prey to predator in a transformation that made Garrison's psychological masks look like children's Halloween costumes. My sister. The one you drove to suicide 3 years ago. Sterling and I have been planning this for 37 months. Bethany's hands flew across her phone screen, not texting, but initiating a complex digital protocol that would wipe their servers and destroy evidence. Except her phone screen went black, then displayed a single message. Hello, Bethany. Or should I say, Jennifer Steele. The use of her real name, her birth name, made Bethany freeze. She looked at Garrison with eyes that suddenly seemed very young, very lost. Dad? The word hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Even Brixton and Coulter seemed surprised, their carefully maintained personas cracking at this revelation. Garrison Steele had recruited his own daughter into his psychological warfare unit, had transformed her into a weapon just like all the others. Touching family reunion, Marlowe said, pulling something from her pocket. Not the transponder they'd detected, but a second device that had been hidden inside a false tooth cavity, transmitting everything for the past 40 minutes to an FBI surveillance van that had been disguised as a broken-down RV in the parking lot. Jennifer, your testimony against your father will probably get you reduced charges. 20 years instead of life. You're lying, Bethany, Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd been trained to detect deception, and she couldn't find any in Marlowe's steady gaze. The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off for 3 full seconds. When they came back on, the restaurant's dynamics had completely shifted. Damon had moved, not toward the exits, but away from them, positioning himself equidistant from everyone else. His silence broke with 4 words that changed everything. I'm with them. Garrison's shock was genuine this time. Damon Flint, the man he'd saved from suicide after the friendly fire incident, the most loyal of his converts, was a plant. Had always been a plant. 2 years, Damon said, his voice rusty from disuse but clear. I've been wearing a wire for 2 years, recording every session, every manipulation, every crime. He pulled open his shirt, revealing not just a wire but an entire recording apparatus that had been surgically implanted beneath skin grafts from his burn treatments. Patricia Vance, who wasn't Patricia at all, started backing toward the bathroom, but Marlowe shook her head. Sarah Chen, formerly Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, Naval Intelligence. Your husband thinks you're dead. Your children think you're dead. Garrison convinced you that disappearing was the only way to protect them from your enemies, didn't he? Except the enemies were all in your head, planted there by months of his psychological manipulation. The woman who'd called herself Patricia crumbled, her carefully maintained composure shattering as suppressed memories began surfacing. Garrison's methods included a form of hypnotic suggestion that could bury true memories beneath false ones. But the right trigger words could bring everything back. The weather's here, Coulter announced, looking out the window where blue and red lights were beginning to paint the parking lot in alternating colors. But instead of moving to escape, he sat down in the nearest booth, placed his hands flat on the table, and said, I want to make a deal. Coulter's been keeping records, Marlowe revealed, watching Garrison's face cycle through another series of micro-expressions. Every victim, every operation, every contact in your network. He's got it all on encrypted drives hidden in 12 different locations. Isn't that right, Coulter? Coulter nodded, not looking at Garrison. You saved me, gave me purpose, taught me everything about psychological manipulation. But you also taught me to recognize when I was being manipulated. Took me 3 years to break free of your programming. Another 2, to position myself where I could document everything. Brixton was the last piece on the board still loyal to Garrison, and even he was wavering, looking between his leader and the others with growing uncertainty. This is another test, right? Another game to see who breaks first? The only game, Marlowe said, is the one Garrison's been playing with all of you. Brixton, you were never discharged for a crime you didn't commit. You were discharged for a crime Garrison committed and framed you for. He needed you broken, desperate, grateful. It's all in the files we recovered from his storage unit in Baltimore. The FBI agents were at the door now, but they weren't rushing in. This psychological unraveling was more valuable than any physical arrest. Every word was being recorded. Every revelation another nail in Garrison's legal coffin. Garrison stood in the center of his collapsing empire, and for the first time since Marlowe had met him, he looked genuinely human. Vulnerable. Almost fragile. Then he started laughing. Not the calculated laugh from before, but something wild and unhinged. Brilliant, he said, applauding slowly. Absolutely brilliant. A 7-layer reversal with embedded psychological triggers and family dynamics. Sterling trained you well, Marlowe. Or should I say, he trained you exactly the way I taught him to when he was my student at Quantico. The revelation should have been devastating. Sterling Pike, FBI agent and Marlowe's brother, had been Garrison's student. But Marlowe's expression didn't change. She'd known, had always known. It was why Sterling understood Garrison's methods so well, why he'd been able to design the perfect counter-operation. The difference between Sterling and you, Marlowe said quietly, is that he learned your techniques to help people. You use them to destroy them. Help? Destroy? Garrison's voice took on a professorial tone, even now unable to resist the urge to lecture. Those are arbitrary distinctions. I liberate people from their illusions. I show them who they really are beneath all the lies society tells them to believe. Your sister Gracelyn, she wasn't strong enough for the truth. That's not my fault. It was the wrong thing to say. Marlowe's control, maintained through 40 minutes of psychological warfare, finally snapped. But instead of attacking physically, she pulled out a phone. Gracelyn's phone, kept charged and maintained for 3 years, and played a voice message. Gracelyn's voice filled the restaurant. Sterling, Marlowe, if you're listening to this, it means he won. Garrison Steele is not human. He's something else. Something that feeds on pain and confusion. I can feel my mind fragmenting, and I know that soon I won't even remember who I really am. But before I lose myself completely, I need you to know he has a daughter, Jennifer. He's been programming her since she was 7. She's the key to stopping him. Save her, even if you can't save me. Bethany, Jennifer, let out a sound that was part sob, part scream. Her father had been experimenting on her for over 20 years, using her as a prototype for his psychological manipulation techniques. Every memory she had was suspect, every emotion potentially programmed. I remember, she whispered, staring at Garrison with eyes that held 2 decades of suppressed horror. The basement sessions, the games that went on for hours, the way you'd make me forget afterward. make me think we'd been playing chess or reading stories. Sterling Pike entered the restaurant then, not in FBI tactical gear, but in a simple suit, his badge visible but his weapon holstered. He looked exactly like Marlowe. Same bone structure, same intelligent eyes, same ability to project calm in chaos. "Garrison Steele," he said formally, "you're under arrest for 47 counts of kidnapping, psychological torture, conspiracy to commit fraud, and murder in the first degree." Murder. Garrison seemed genuinely puzzled. "I've never killed anyone." "Driving someone to suicide through systematic psychological torture is murder in 7 states now," Sterling replied. "Thanks to Graceland's law, passed 18 months ago. You've been so focused on your games, you didn't notice the legal landscape changing around you." The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Garrison didn't resist as Sterling cuffed him, didn't speak as his rights were read. But his eyes never left Marlowe's face, and in them was a promise that this game was far from over. As they led him out, he said one thing: "Ask Sterling about Chicago." Sterling's face went pale, but he didn't respond, just pushed Garrison toward the waiting FBI van. Marlowe filed the reaction away. Another layer to unpack, another game within the game. The next hours were a blur of statements, evidence collection, and debriefings. Sarah Chen was reunited with her family, who had been told she'd died in a classified operation. Brixton learned the truth about his discharge and the evidence that would clear his name. Coulter negotiated immunity in exchange for his encrypted files and testimony. Damon revealed he'd been working with the FBI to atone for the civilians his unit had accidentally killed, deaths that weren't friendly fire but Garrison's manipulation of intel that had led them to the wrong coordinates. Jennifer Steele was placed in protective custody and began the long process of psychological deprogramming. The specialists said it would take years to untangle what was real from what her father had implanted. 3 months later, the trial began. The courthouse in Baltimore was packed every day, the media calling it the Mindhunter trial. Garrison defended himself, turning the courtroom into another psychological battlefield. For 7 weeks, he questioned witnesses with surgical precision, exposing their traumas, their weaknesses, their deepest fears. But for every attack, Marlowe and Sterling had prepared a counter. They'd spent 3 years studying him, learning his patterns, understanding his techniques. When he tried to trigger Jennifer's programmed responses, they had therapists ready with counter-conditioning. When he attempted to manipulate jury members, they had experts explaining his techniques in real time. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon: guilty on all charges. 120 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Garrison looked at Marlowe one last time. "This isn't over," he mouthed silently. She mouthed back, "Yes, it is." But that night, Marlowe received a text from an unknown number. "The circuit has 7 heads. You've only cut off 1. G2. Sterling confirmed what she'd suspected. Garrison had protégés, other psychologists he'd trained in his methods. The chameleon circuit was bigger than just one man. Chicago, the thing Garrison had mentioned, was where the second cell operated. 6 months later, Marlowe was back on the road, driving her Kenworth through the night. But now she wasn't hauling electronics. Her cargo was different: surveillance equipment, psychological assessment tools, and a list of 7 names. Task Force Omega had expanded, and she was their primary field operative. The CB radio crackled to life. "Eastbound and down. This is Sterling Pike checking in. Chicago cell confirmed active. You ready for round 2? Marlowe picked up the handset, looking at the photo taped to her dashboard. Her and Gracelyn at her sister's Naval Academy graduation, both of them smiling and unaware of what was coming. "Roger that," she replied. "The pike always strikes twice." As she drove into the darkness, the lights of another truck stop. Popeyes appeared in the distance. She didn't stop. Some places, once you've faced your demons there, lose their power over you. But somewhere out there, in another late-night restaurant, another predator was playing another game with another victim. The chameleon circuit was wounded but not dead. Garrison was imprisoned but not defeated. And Marlowe Pike, who'd started as a delivery girl in the outline but had become something far more dangerous, would keep driving, keep hunting, keep protecting those who didn't even know they needed protection. Because that's what you did for family, even the family you'd never met. You stood between them and the monsters, even when the monsters looked like helpful strangers in fast food restaurants at 3 in the morning. The story ended where it began, with a truck rolling through the night, its driver vigilant and ready. But now the stakes were clear, the enemy identified, and the war far from over. Justice had been served at that Popeyes off Interstate 95, but it was just the first course in a much larger meal. The chameleons were still out there, changing their colors, wearing their masks, playing their games, but now they knew someone was hunting them. Someone who understood their techniques, their psychology, their weaknesses. Someone who'd learned from the best and turned those lessons against him. The pike had struck once. It would strike again.